In this video, I'll discuss adding images to BugGuide. I'll discuss how to add an image, including how to navigate to wherever in the guide you want to add an image and how to know where to add it. And I'll also briefly discuss editing images. I'll begin with an example of a few images I have of a moth I collected last year. Since I know what species this moth is, I'm going to add it directly to the species page. There are two basic ways to find the species page. One is to search the name of the species. A bunch of images show up when I do this. Most of these images are of the species I photographed, but not all of them are. And there are a lot of images of the species that haven't showed up here. Which images showed up here? Well, it's any image that has my search terms, Epiblema and Scuderiana, in any field in the image. That includes the title of the image, as in this case. Or as in this case, of an Epiblema glenni, in the description section, as a suggested identification. So if I find the species page this way, I need to be careful that the image I click on is the species I found. And I do this by looking above the image to see the taxonomy, or by looking at the italicized species name appended to the title automatically. If I go to the Info tab, I see that I'm in the right place because this is the page for Epiblema scuderiana. Now I need to go to the Images tab, and here I'll add my image. You can see I've actually added two sets of images tonight because this is my third take. Those two are practice rounds. Okay, so now I'm going to add my image. Click Add Image. For my title, I'm just going to add the name of the species. If you add an image to a species or genus page, the name of the genus or species is automatically added to your title in italics. And if all you add in the title is the scientific name, that's all that's going to show up when I submit the image. But I could instead add, for instance, the common name. And if I do that, once I submit the image, the common name will show up, and then the scientific name will appear in italics. So how you want to title it is up to you. But those are two straightforward and nice looking titles. Next sections are the state/province sections and the county section. Now you'll notice that these have automatically been filled in, and that's because on my user page, if you go to your account page here, you can edit my user information. I've selected my default state and my default county. This is a good idea if you submit most of your images from one place, which I do. So, my state is Rhode Island, county is Washington. Note that you should not add county here because that's automatically added. Add only the name of the county, and make sure also that your title, all your fields don't have extraneous spaces because those will mess up the titles. Okay. For instance, if I add an extra space here or an extra space here, the name will appear twice in the title. Because it's only if I add exactly the scientific name, nothing more, nothing less, that's italicized and nothing else is added. Okay. For city or location, I'm adding Block Island. There are a few different ways to do this. One is just to add the incorporated place or unincorporated place where you found it. So you could add Block Island, or you could do Dallas or Houston or Miami. Or you could also do you can add a prominent geographic feature. For instance, if you found something in the Huachaca Mountains in Arizona, you can add that there. I think I mispronounced that, but anyway. Next is date. And you want to keep the city or location simple. It should be easy to find. Another option is to add the coordinates. So the coordinates in my case are as such. Now, I should note that the 5th digit after the decimal place in latitude and longitude is accurate to about 1 meter. So you really should never be adding 6 digits, because the 6th digit is accurate to 10 centimeters, and I can guarantee that there's no real purpose for that level of accuracy. But in my case, I'm just doing Block Island. Now for date, that should be the date of observation. In this case, I took this photo on June 25th, 2020 at 3 a.m. But I actually found this individual on June 23rd, then stuck it in my fridge and photographed it a day later. So the date is going to be June 23rd, 2020. Size, you should generally leave blank. Fill it in only if you have measured a size, perhaps the forewing length or the wingspan or the total length. You should add something there only if you've measured the size precisely or to a reasonable degree of accuracy. Size is rarely useful in identification, and when it is useful, it's useful only if it's fairly accurate. So if it's just a rough estimate, leave that blank. Next is the identifier field. And this is used not to indicate who identified the image. If someone else identified it for you, add it in the remarks section. The identifier field is used for search terms only. And I'll discuss that in the next video regarding organizing and placing your images. But in this case, I'm just going to leave it blank. So I dragged and dropped my image here. You can, of course, search, choose file here. You can search the image. Dragging and dropping is the fastest way. I'm not going to add any remarks. Typically, in the remarks section, you could add something like found at UV light, or found flying over a field, or found in a field. Or you can report what plant you found something on. But since I just found this moth out of light, like almost all the moths I observe, I'm leaving it blank. Okay. Representative is automatically checked. You can uncheck it if you want, but you should do that if your image is really not good and you're adding the image only because it's a notable record. This image is perfectly fine, so I'm leaving that checked. The representative field, I'll explain in a minute, but this should be checked unless your image is really bad. I'm leaving male and female unchecked because I have no idea whether this is a male or a female. I'm checking adult because it has fully developed wings, which in an insect means it's an adult. And in any adult that undergoes complete metamorphosis, only the adults have wings of any kind. I'm not selecting immature, of course, because it's not an immature. You should leave copyright owner empty if it's your own image. If it's someone else's image, which you're using with permission, then add that person's name there. With everything filled out the way I want it to be, I'm adding the image. Now here's the image. The reason I didn't fill in the copyright field is that my username appears there. And it's linked to my user page. If instead I were to add my name here, which I'm going to do by editing the image, it shows up, but now it's not a link to my user page. So you can add it if you want, but there's really no sense in doing it. There's no purpose if it's your own image. Okay. Now, of course, to edit your image, as I just did, click Edit. Maybe you made a mistake somewhere you want to fix. Also, if you need to delete your image, which I'll explain why I might want to do that in the next video. Click here. You need to confirm, then you can delete. But I'm not going to delete since I want to keep the image. Also, you can deselect subscribe. Subscribe means you receive email notifications if someone comments on the image. But there's really never any reason to deselect that because you want to be able to keep track of what happens to your images. Notice also that the identifier field was automatically filled out with the file name, which means if I copy this and search the file name, this image will show up. It's actually not going to show up. Probably other people's images will show up because that's a pretty common file name. It's not going to show up because generally searches take an hour or two to update with new images. I don't know why it's not searching, but I'm not going to wait for it to load. So let's say I have multiple images of this species, which I do, or multiple images of this individual. I'm going to click Add Image, and I'll add this other image. Drag and drop. Notice that all the fields are the same. You don't need to edit anything. And submit. And now these images are linked. If I made a mistake and I uploaded images of two separate individuals, I'll have to unlink them. Now, images should be linked only if they're of the same individual. If they're different individuals, even if it's the same species found in the same location at the same time, they should be unlinked. There are a few exceptions to this. One is if you're photographing members of a colony, say an ant colony or a bee colony, it's useful to link them so that people can see multiple individuals from the same colony. It might help with identification, especially if you photograph, say, a queen ant and also some worker ants. I can unlink like this, but I don't actually want to unlink, so I'm going to relink them. I'm going to tag this image. I'm going to find the other image here, tag that one, and then I'll link them together again. Another exception to the rule that only images of the same individual should be linked, is if you find a mating pair. You might want to add images of that mating pair, and then let's say the pair separate later. You can photograph them individually and then add those images, and those should be added with the images of the mating pair. But in almost all cases, only the same individual. Now I actually have a third image of this individual, so I'm going to add that too. And this one, you'll notice, this photograph was taken in October 2021, more than a year later. But I'm not changing the date of observation, since this is just when the photograph of the long dead moth was taken. It was still observed the same day. So I'll add that image too. Now I have all three images. Since I didn't deselect representative, if I refresh this page enough, eventually those images I just added will show up here. Each time you navigate to a species page, a random selection of 8 images of that species, 8 of the images here, place that species, will show up here. Also, if I go to, say, this page, the page of the subfamily this belongs to, 8 random images of 8 random images placed to this subfamily, or any subordinate taxa. 8 images of any of these will show up here. So let's say I don't actually know what this is. I do know what it is, but let's say I don't. Let's say I'm pretty sure it's an epiblemma, but I don't know which species. As a rule, it's not a good idea to add images to species pages, to genus pages. There are some exceptions to this, but generally you shouldn't do it. And the reason for this is that they often aren't checked very often. So if you want to add an image to get identified, you want to add it somewhere where it'll be seen by people who might identify. And there are an awful lot of genus pages on BugGuide, so they tend not to get checked very much. There are some exceptions for especially very common genera, but for the most part they aren't checked, so you don't really want to add that. Unless I'm confident, let's say I know it's an epiblema and I know it's something that's very difficult to identify, then I might want to add it here, because chances are if I add it somewhere else, it'll just go here first. But let's say I know this is an epiblema, and I really don't know anything about identification of epiblema. Maybe this is easy to identify, maybe it's hard to identify, but I just don't know. I can hope someone else on BugGuide will know. I could add it to the tribe. There are a lot of images placed to this tribe. And of course, if I add my images, they'll show up here, right at the start. They'll be the first ones. So this would be a perfectly fine place to add the images. You could also, of course, add them to Lepidoptera. As the main identifier of moths on BugGuide, I can tell you that if you add your image here, it will be seen. I will probably see it the day you add it, although I may not get to identifying it because thousands of images are added of moths on BugGuide every year, and I tend to leave identifying a lot of them to the winter. So if you add it in May, I may not identify it, may not get to it until December or February, but I will get to it eventually. So there are a few places I can add it. Let's say I know it's tortured, but I don't know anything past that. I could add it to the tortured page. There are some pages, though, that you shouldn't add to. Let's take, for example, Tortricordia. You'll notice that the images that show up for Tortricordia are exactly the same as the images for Tortricity. That's because there are actually no images placed directly to Tortricordia. The first image here, if you look at the taxonomy, is placed to Tortricity. If there are no images or very few images placed to a taxon, that's a pretty good sign it's somewhere you should not add your images. And there's a good reason there are no images placed to Tortricordia, and it's that there's only one family in that superfamily. So any image that can be identified to Tortricordia can also be identified to Tortricity. So any images that get added there get moved elsewhere. And since images really shouldn't be added there, that page is checked very infrequently. I check it probably once every few months just to move the handful of images people have mistakenly added there. So you don't want to add your images there. Another bad idea would be adding them to Insecta. If you know it's a moth, there's no reason to add it here. But let's say you know something's an insect and you just don't know what kind of insect. You don't even know what order it is. There's barely one page of images here, which means it's not really a place you should be adding images. It may not be checked infrequently, or sometimes it may be checked frequently. But usually if there are few images, it isn't checked frequently. When in doubt, just add them here. ID request. This is where you can add any images of anything, any arthropods. And perhaps an expert will see an image here and move it straight to species or straight to family. Or maybe an editor will eventually move it to, say, an order page, and someone also identify it from there. But if you add it to ID request, it will get dealt with. It won't just go lost. Another important thing to mention regarding adding images is that you should crop images. I'll also add this image as another example. This one is currently not at all cropped. This is just the raw image. Now, there are a few reasons to crop images. One is that they just look nicer in the guide. There are also purely selfish reasons to crop your images. Well, there's one big one, which is that uncropped images tend not to get identified very quickly because they're annoying to look at and annoying to identify. Also, weirdly cropped images often aren't identified quickly. If I had my image like this, even if it's tightly cropped, it might not get identified anytime soon. For moths, if you photograph the moth from the side, you should have the head facing left, or more preferably, because this is the standard on BugGuide, flip the image and have it facing right. This one I photographed on the left side, but I can just flip the image, and now it's facing to the right, which most images on BugGuide are. I also may want to lighten this image or otherwise adjust it. You don't want to adjust it so that it looks unnatural. It should look the way the moth looked in life, or the way whatever you photographed looked in life. Maybe I want to brighten that up a bit. And now I'm ready to add the image. So again, I know what this is, so I'm going to add it directly to the species page. Here I'm searching the species name without the genus. There's kind of a mix of things that show up, and that's because there's this species, Olothrudis olivatiana, which of course is not what I photographed. There are also some things that have just been misidentified that'll show up. This one, the person who submitted suggested Olothrudis olivatiana as the ID, but it actually isn't that, as I mentioned previously. But the one I photographed is this species. So I'm going to add my image. Now there's actually a trick to adding images of species you've seen before that makes it faster. The kind of standard way is to fill everything out like this by clicking Add Image. But let's say I want to take a shortcut. Well, I can go here. This is a previously added image of this same species from 2017. And this shortcut is mostly useful if you're adding an image from the same location, which I basically always do because almost everything I add is from Block Island. So I'm going to click Add Image here. The title's already filled out. That's already what I want. These two fields are already filled out, although of course these are automatically filled out when I click Add Image. The city's automatically filled out. The date, of course, is filled out, but that's the date I photographed this one, or found that one, not the date I found this one. This is from June 30th, 2020. I just need to change this date. June 30th, 2020. Make sure you change the date. If you're going to use the shortcut, you have to make sure you change the date. Otherwise, you'll add a bunch of images with the wrong dates. And adult is, of course, already selected. Don't want to add any remarks, and I'm going to submit. And now I have the image. And since these are different individuals, photographed 3 years apart no less, I need to unlink them. And now everything is just as it would have been if I'd clicked Add Image in the first place. In this case, I actually want to add an identifier, because this is from a black lighting night I did. This is the identifier I used for that night. Now I'm going to edit it. Now if I copy this identifier here, and as I said, identifiers are used for search terms. These will show up. I'll discuss this more in a later video. But just to reiterate, the identifier field is used for search purposes only. That's about it for adding images. In the next video, I'm going to discuss how to manage your images. This includes, of course, using identifier terms if you want to. There are a number of uses for those. This includes moving your images around in the guide, editing images especially once they've been identified. And it also includes finding your images, knowing where your images are located, figuring out which images you've added already, if you aren't sure whether you've added an image before. Because you of course don't want to add the same image many times. But that's it for adding images.